Hi friends, this is Sarvajan here. Welcome to my networking channel. Hope all are doing good. And today the topic I'm going to discuss about how to redistribute between BGP and OSPF routing protocol in FortiGate firewall. So for that I conducted three firewall, FortiGate firewall 1, 2 and 3. So between firewall 1 and 2 I'm going to establish an EBGP neighbor relationship. So firewall 1 is in autonomous system number 1 and firewall 2 is in autonomous system number 2. So I'm going to establish an EBGP neighbor relationship, and between firewall 2 and 3 I'm going to configure the OSPF as a routing protocol, and this subnet is 192.168.1.0. so this end IP is 1.1, so this is 1.2, and this is 2.1 and 2.2. okay, so first I'm going to define the directly connected interfaces for all these three firewall. Then I will be configuring EBGP neighbor relationship between firewall 1 and 2, then OSPF as a routing protocol between firewall 2 and 3. Then I will be configuring the redistribution between BGP and OSPF. okay, and the last thing is I will be configuring the policy. So these are the four things I am going to do. So prior to the configuration, first let us define the directly connected interfaces for all these three firewall. okay, so for that I have defined the script, so it will make the work more easier. So let us copy this. So this is for configuring the individual interfaces. okay, so as we know, what is the command for configuring the directly connected interfaces? Config system interface edit port 1. So by default the mode is DHCP. So I'm changing the to static mode and assigning a static IP. Then I will be allowing the ping access. So this end IP is 192.168.1.1. okay, so this firewall has one directly connected interface. So let us configure this. So it is 1.1. Just copy it and paste it on the first firewall and just save the configuration. And second firewall has two directly connected interfaces. This end is 1.1 for port 1, port 2 interface is 2.1. okay, so let us change accordingly. For port 1 1.2, and for port 2 it is 2.1. okay, so because this has two directly interfaces, so let us copy and paste it. 2.1 for port 2 and 1.2 for port 1. okay, so just copy it and paste it on the second firewall. Just log in, paste it on the second firewall, and now let us view the configuration. So the command to configure is check is show system interface port 1. okay, this is my first interface. Second interface is 2.1. okay, so similar way the third firewall has only one interface, that is 2.2 for port 2. okay, so let us change it accordingly. For port 2 it is 2.2. so just copy it and paste it on the third firewall. Just log in with admin password. okay, so we have done with the directly connected interface configuration. So now what we can do is, for testing the ping connectivity, we can just test by pinging to the remote interface. So from the firewall 3, let us ping the remote interface. okay, go to firewall 3, ping the remote interface. It is execute ping 192.168.2.1. I am able to reach 2.1, that the remote interface, and from the firewall 1 let us ping this interface 1.2. okay, go here, execute ping, so 192.168.1.2. so I'm able to reach. So now the second part is I will be configuring EBGP as a routing protocol between firewall 1 and 2, or I am going to establish a EBGP neighbor relationship between firewall 1 and 2. Then we'll configure the OSPF. So first let us finish up the EBGP configuration. okay, so let us go to firewall 1. So the command to configure BGP is config router BGP. In case of Cisco, what we'll do router BGP followed by the autonomous system number. So in case of FortiGate firewall, it is config router BGP and set the router ID. So firewall 1, I'm going to set it as 1.1.1. okay, then we have to configure the neighbor statement. Prior to that, we have to define the autonomous system number. So the local AS is AS1. okay, so let us define that. okay, set AS is 1. Then we have to define the neighbor, edit neighbor. So then we have to define config neighbor. okay, then we have to edit that particular statement. That means I'm adding the neighbor, edit 192.168.1.2. so this is syntax for configuring the neighbor. 1.2 is the neighbor. okay, so it is already added, right? Neighbor is already added. Then we have to set the remote autonomous system. That is remote autonomous system is 2. Local is 1. Remote is 2. Since it's an EBGP neighbor relationship, save the configuration, and under BGP again configure a network and advertise this particular prefix. Okay. So for that the command is config network and add the statement, first statement, set the prefix 192.168.1.0/24 and save the configuration. So we have done with the BGP configuration. How to view the configuration is show router BGP. So what are things we have done is we have configured the router BGP, set the local AS and the router ID. Then we have added the neighbor as 1.2 and we have added the neighbor in the remote autonomous system and system number 2. And then through network statement, I have defined the prefix. So that's all about the EBGP neighbor relationship from firewall 1. So now let us jump to firewall 2 and let us set a EBGP to this firewall 1. Okay. So let us go to firewall 2. The command is config router BGP, set the router ID as 2.2.2, set the local autonomous system number is 2. So from firewall 2, this AS is 2. Then we have to define the neighbor. Okay, so config neighbor, add the neighbor statement as 192.168.1.1. That is a neighbor, right? Neighbor IP is 1.1, this is 1.2. So 1.1, then set the remote autonomous system as 1. So the local is 2 and the remote autonomous system number is 1. Save the configuration. Now let us define the network and advertise the prefix. So the prefix is again same 192.168.1.0/24 is a prefix. Okay. So edit 1 and advertise the prefix as 192.168.1.0/24. That's all. Okay. Now save the configuration and now let us view the configuration. It is show router BGP. Okay, you are able to see here, right? So local AS is 2, remote AS is 1 and the neighbor statement is 192.168.1.1. So these are the three things you have to do from BGP perspective. One is config router BGP and set the autonomous system and the router ID, and through config neighbor set the neighbor statement and set the remote AS. Then through network statement, config network statement, I am advertising the prefix. So these are three things you have to do for eBGP neighbor relationship. So now let us check the BGP neighbor relationship between firewall 1 and 2. So okay, go to firewall 1, get router info BGP summary. So that means already the neighbor is established. 1.2 I am able to see. Let us check from firewall 2. So get router info BGP summary. So neighbor is established EBGB. You are able to see the local AS and the remote autonomous system number. Okay, and the neighbor also. So now the second part I am going to configure OSPF as a routing protocol between firewall 2 and firewall 3. So let us finish out the OSPF configuration. Then we have to configure the redistribution. Okay. So go to firewall 2 and configure the OSPF. So this OSPF I am going to establish between firewall 2 and 3 for this corresponding port 2, right? So go to the firewall 2. So the command is config router OSPF, okay, and set the router ID. So here we already set the router ID as 2.2.2, okay. Then we have to add the area. We have to define it in area, backbone area, right? So edit 0.0.0.0. So that means I'm defining in backbone area. Then save the configuration. Then advertise the prefix. So config network. So now the prefix is 2.0. This prefix I'm going to advertise between this firewall 2 and 3 for OSPF. So now edit 1. I'm adding the statement as 1. Set the prefix as 192.168.2.0/24 and save the configuration. So we have done with the OSPF configuration for this particular firewall 2 and for this port 2. Similar way for the firewall 3 also I'm going to configure the OSPF configuration. So let us jump to firewall 3 and log in with the credentials. Now configure the OSPF. Okay. So config router OSPF. In case of Cisco, it is router OSPF followed by the process ID. So in case of FortiGate firewall, it is config router OSPF. That is the difference in syntax. Config router OSPF. Set the router ID 3.3.3 Then okay, configure the area. I'm going to define this in a backbone area. Okay, 0.0.0.0. Okay, then save the configuration. Then configure the network statement, and that network I'm going to advertise this prefix. So just make an entry, add an entry, set prefix 192.168.2.0/24, then save the configuration. So okay, we have successfully established the OSPF between firewall 2 and 3. So now let us check the OSPF neighbor relationship. Let us go to firewall 2. So get router info OSPF neighbor. So that means the neighbor relationship is established successfully. Okay, so get router info OSPF neighbor. So the final things what we have to do is, okay, we have to configure the redistribution from BGP to OSPF and from OSPF to BGP. I'm going to do a mutual redistribution between these two routing protocol. So go to firewall 2, config router OSPF. Let us redistribute the BGP. So the command is pretty simple. So config redistribute BGP. Then we have to enable this. So the command is set status enable. Save the configuration, and also one more thing is pending is we have to also config redistribute. We have to also redistribute the connected routes in case of OSPF. Okay. So the command is config router OSPF config redistribute connected routes, and then save the configuration. Okay, so these are the two things mandatory in OSPF config router OSPF. I am redistributing the BGP routes and also the connected routes. So first one redistribution is completed. So now let us redistribute from BGP to OSPF. So first what we have done is we have redistributed from BGP into OSPF. Now let us do the reverse way. Okay, so the command is config router BGP. Now we have to redistribute OSPF into BGP. So the same thing you have to follow. Config redistribute BGP. Okay, config router BGP, you have to do config redistribute OSPF, right? So we have to do config redistribute OSPF. Then we have to set the status enable. Okay, save the configuration. Similar way, config redistribute. So config router BGP and config redistribute connected routes. So these two things are mandatory, and set the status as enable. Okay, so that means what I have done is I have successfully redistributed from BGP to OSPF and OSPF into BGP, and also I have redistributed the connected routes also. So we have to set the status enable for enabling the redistribution. Let us now view the configuration. Show router OSPF. So you can see here. So first we have defined the basic OSPF statement, then config redistribute BGP, we have set the status as enable, and we have to config redistribute connector also, we have to set the status as enable. So that we have to do it. So config, okay, router OSPF and config redistribute connector, set status enable. Save the configuration. So now let us view the configuration. Show router OSPF. You are able to see config redistribute connected is enabled, and also config redistribute BGP, the status is enabled. That means I redistributed the connected and the BGP routes into OSPF. Similar way, let us check for BGP also. Show router BGP. Okay. So config redistribute connector, that is also enabled. That means I redistributed the connected routes in BGP. Additionally, also I redistributed the OSPF routes into BGP. So these two things I have done. So now let us check the routing entries of BGP. So whether the OSPF routes are redistributed into BGP and the BGP routes are redistributed into OSPF. So let us check the routing table, admin and login. So get router info routing table all. So that means now I'm able to see the redistributed routes in BGP, right? So you're able to see the remote network 192.168.2. network I'm able to see. Similarly, let us check the routing table of firewall 3. So this should be advertised as external route in OSPF routing table. Okay, let us go to firewall 3, get router info, routing table all. So I'm able to see. So now let us do a ping to the remote interface. Okay, so firewall 3, I have to ping 1.1 and firewall 1, I have to ping 2.2. Let us ping. So execute ping remote interfaces 192.168.1.1. So I may have not able to reach. Similar way, let us check from firewall 1 also. Execute ping 192.168.2.2 also. I am not able to reach. Why? Because I already told in my previous video, we have to configure a firewall policy for port 1 to port 2 and port 2 to port 1 communication. So okay, let us quickly configure those policy. So let us copy from the script. Already I defined the script. So the command is config firewall policy, making the first entry. Source interface will be port 1, destination is port 2, and the remaining parameters are default. Okay, I'm set source address as all, destination address as all, and schedule is always, and service is also all, and action should be accept. Similarly, for the second policy, I added like port 2 to port 1, and the remaining parameters are same. So all these parameters are mandatory for configuring the firewall policy. So otherwise you can't save the configuration. So define source interface, destination interface, source address, destination address, or if you want to do any specific schedule, you can schedule it. Here I got defined as always, and the service is also all, and action is accept. So now let us copy this both the policy and let us paste it. Then let us check the ping to the remote interface. Okay, so let us go ahead and paste the configuration. So how to view the policy? Show firewall policy. Okay, so now you're able to see from port 1 to port 2 the policy is allowed, and also from port 2 to port 1 it is allowed. So that means I allow the ICMP traffic, right? So now let us do a ping from firewall 1 to firewall 3. So let us do a ping. Previously I was not able to ping. So now you're able to see I'm able to ping the remote interface, and also from firewall 3 let us ping. I'm able to ping. So that's all about this video. So what are things we have done is, first we have configured the directly connected interfaces with all this IP address, and then we have configured eBGP neighbor relationship between firewall 1 and 2. Then we have configured OSPF as a routing protocol between firewall 2 and 3. Then we have configured the redistribution from BGP into OSPF and OSPF into BGP, what we called as a mutual redistribution. And then finally we have configured a policy for allowing the communication between the different subnets, or for allowing the ICMP traffic between the remote subnets, right? And that's all about this video. I hope you enjoy this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more videos. Thanks and have a wonderful day. Thank you.